very honored to have Dr. Mario Novelli. Dr. Mario Novelli is a professor in the political economy of education at the Center for International Education, CIE, University of Sussex. And he's also Dean's Distinguished Research Fellow, Faculty of Education, Monash University, Melbourne, Australia. He has been working at the University of Amsterdam, University of Bristol, and he has been drawing on the tools of critical political economy. And his recent work has focused on the relationship between education, conflict, and international development. He has written a lot on issues related to the global governance of education, peace building, and education, and the role of social movements in conflict context. Is such a broad landscape that Dr. Novelli has been working in that I've just introduced just a little bit and can never do justice to him. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours. We are very eager to learn. G, over to you.
Oh, okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Excellent. Well, first of all, Professor Tamim, thank you very much for the invitation, which I was very happy to accept. And thank you all for taking the time out to come and listen. I hope I can do justice to your presence. I'm going to talk, I will try to talk no more than 30 minutes, definitely, because I'm really interested in hearing your questions and your reflections on some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I've been arguing this all of my career, but I put this down in paper that was published over the summer, and I given a series of talks over the last year, and yeah, it certainly seems to have delighted and enraged people equally. Some people write me emails that are very thankful that I've written this paper and very happy with it, but others, maybe they don't write to me, but in dark corners they complain and are disappointed, and even there is a sense of betrayal. So I hopefully I can explain a bit. I mean, the paper is open access. It's available to you all. I hope you will use that afterwards, use it with your students, use it with colleagues, at least as a talking point to get people reflecting. And I'm very happy to be talking also today in Pakistan, because in a sense Pakistan is very much part of the story in the center of the paper, and I'm interested to hear from colleagues based in Pakistan your reflections on some of these arguments. So I'll leave it at that and get into the substance. I guess this paper and this talk was really a product of responding to some events that emerged during the pandemic, from the terrible police murder and assassination of George Floyd in 2020, to a range of scandals within the international development aid industry, sex and prostitution scandals, a number of protests from South Africa around Rhodes Must Fall, arguments around the colonial legacies that exist in South Africa and their effect in the present, that really started to force a whole range of institutions, including my own university, to reflect on its relationship with race, with empire, with colonialism, with patriarchy, with imperialism. Whole range of movements from Me Too to Black Lives Matter started to, in a sense, push a debate beyond the margins into the mainstream of society. And as a result of that, a range of debates around the relationship between the past and the present, but also between individuals and institutions. And in a sense, my paper is about kind of reflecting on where do we as academics, as practitioners, as educators who operate within institutions link to some of these past and present violations of human rights, atrocities, etc. You know, I, in a sense, have worked for the last 20 years or more on this relationship between education and conflict. I didn't intend to do that. It's about my personal history. I lived and worked in Palestine. I had visited Kashmir in a young age, and saw some of the things that were going on in India, Kashmir. I saw a range of things going on in Palestine, and I ended up in Latin America, in Colombia, as a teacher, as an aid worker, engaging in a range of contexts that were mired in conflict, but I was a teacher. I was an educator. So how was the relationship between these two? And after I did my PhD, I started to work more and more on this relationship between education and conflict. And in a sense, my own academic career also parallels the growth of this new field of exploring the relationship between education, conflict, and crisis, which, for those of you that are engaged in that, is often known as education in emergencies. So this paper really is trying to hone in on the specific field of education in emergencies, although I locate it more generally within the field of comparative and international education, and more generally within the field of international development, because many of us move between practitioner and academic roles, and we often engage in both of those. And so I think it's important to reflect on that. So that's really kind of where, in a sense, the paper came from, an urge to start to think about that. And then, in a sense, it forces you to think about indirect responsibility for atrocities. Yeah, you know, I don't think that many of us could say that we are directly involved in the killing of somebody or the brutal repression of somebody, but we're often in the background. We often play facilitating roles, or sometimes we're silent in the face of these injustices. We turn away from them. And so I think we need a language which starts to open up a vocabulary for reflecting on those slightly distant relationships, but nevertheless important. And that leads you into a range of debates. Hannah Arendt, in the early 1950s, in her book, The Banality of Evil, started to try to talk about that the shocking thing is not the perpetrators. It's all of the people in the background that normalize those violent processes. So there you start to need a language that goes beyond victims and perpetrators and start to think about that. Mahmoud Mamdani, famous Ugandan intellectual, who is in the top left of my slide there, he has talked about survivor, that in a sense we're all survivors of these terrible events. So, you know, there needs to be another language, but of course there are other vocabulary, bystanders, and one thing that I found particularly interested was this idea of the implicated subject. And that came from a professor of Holocaust studies, Michael Rothberg, who wrote a book a few years ago, which talked about the need to go beyond victims and perpetrators and reflect on this. And I'm just going to read a little section of the paper because it needs, I think, to be a bit more precise. So one possible way of moving these debates forward emerges from the work of Michael Rothberg. Dissatisfied with the categories of victim, perpetrator, and bystander, he developed the concept of the implicated subject to better articulate the complex ways that we are connected to injustices, past and present, whether conscious or not. For Rothberg, implicated subjects play essential roles in producing and reproducing violence and inequality, and are morally compromised and most definitely attached, often without their conscious knowledge and in the absence of evil intent, to consequential political and economic dynamics, such that the violence could not have taken place without their involvement. One illustrative example that Rothberg gives is of the person responsible for coordinating the trains that led millions to the death camps during the Nazi Holocaust. Rothberg notes that while the train controller may not have known that he was coordinating the transportation of millions of Nazi victims to death camps, without their involvement, the atrocities would not have taken place in the way that they did. A second illustration is of an American Jewish acquaintance of his who suggested that as they were themselves a victim of the legacy of the Holocaust, they did not feel any responsibility in the United States for the legacies of slavery or contemporary racial injustice. Rothberg, drawing on this implicated subject, reflected on the way his friend, as a white person in the USA, has benefited materially and structurally from the legacies of slavery and ongoing racism. For Rothberg, recognizing implication and reflecting on it is not supposed to be a blame game, but a way of both addressing responsibility and facilitating solidarity. And I quote, "It both draws attention to responsibilities for violence and injustice greater than most of us want to embrace, and shifts questions of accountability from a discourse of guilt to a less legally and emotionally charged terrain of historical and political responsibility." And I think for me, I really like this idea of historical and political responsibility. It's not to beat myself and say, I'm guilty. No, but to recognize responsibility, because recognition leads to action and transformation, to ensure that we don't reproduce those same actions in the future. In this sense, Rothberg suggests that the concept of the implicated subject can both expand understanding of networks of responsibility for injustice and empower action through the recognition of political responsibility rather than guilt. Clearly, not all subjects are equally implicated, and types of implication are varied. In nuancing the concept, he talks of the difference between diachronic and synchronic implicated subjects, with the former reflecting implications in the present of injustices in the past, and the latter on implicated subjects' relationship to present atrocities. So in the rest of the talk, what I will try to do is, in a sense, draw on those two kind of framings and try to think about our field and open up to some questions that you might want to reflect on. So Roger Dale, sociologist of education, and ex-president of the British Association of International and Comparative Education, in 2015, he wrote a paper around the conjunctions of power and comparative education. And he says that the starting point is that the complexity and significance of the relationship between a field of study, let's say education or education in emergencies, as distinct and collective academic endeavors, with that which they seek to explore, so things that happen in the field, comment on, understand and explain are relatively rarely addressed. Exponents of such fields often seem to proceed on the assumption that they are purely driven by the sets of methods, theories, concepts, approaches, and so on that have been developed in the name of comparative education. So basically what he says is there is an assumption, often in academic circles, that the tools, the subjects, the questions, all of the things that we do are driven by our intellectual desires. And what he wants to say is, well, yes, partly, but they're often also driven by funders, societies, external factors that shape the limits of the possible of our labor. And in a sense, what he calls these is the conditions of production. And so, in a sense, in my paper, I'm trying to ask questions about what are the conditions of production of the field of education in emergencies as a field of practice and research. And then, in a sense, you know, once you think like that, you start to think about, well, why did this field emerge? Where did it come from? And what is its evolution? And then start linking it to broader geopolitical, socioeconomic, cultural transformations. So if I take you on let's say a very potted journey of the field of education in emergencies, we can say that it really emerged in the late 1990s. Not that there weren't people working on education, refugee education before that, from the 1940s, 50s, 60s onwards, but that the field really emerged. And it emerged out of in a sense, a failure of achieving the education for all objectives. So the education for all objectives were set in 1990 in Jomtien. The world community comes together and seeks to set a range of targets. The two most important ones emerged was universal primary education and gender equity. And in the late 1990s, 10 years after the Jomtien Accords were signed, the international community realized that they hadn't got very far in its targets. A bit like what's going on with the SDGs as we speak, when we're halfway through. And one of the things that they discovered at that time, that half of all the kids that are out of school were located in contexts of conflict. So they said, we need to do something about conflict. So that's really the underpinning. It mattered because suddenly the international institutions that were measuring these things said, right, conflict matters. We need to understand how. So in a sense, the conditions of production led to a focus on education and conflict. As we move forward, end of the Cold War, rise of US hegemony, we were promised an era of peace and peace dividends, but very quickly, peace was replaced with a range of conflicts in the Balkans, in Africa. A range of different conflicts emerged. And one of the big changes with this was because the Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union stopped using its veto in the Security Council of the United Nations, and the United Nations could act. And it started to act in intervening in the internal affairs of sovereign states, which, you know, is generally been avoided in the United Nations. The argument was of the internal sovereignty of nation states. But there was an argument made that if a state was violating the rights of its own citizens, then we had a right to intervene. Of course, that intervention has been highly selective. Some people are demonized and invaded, and other people are allowed to carry on in their victimization. So we know that this is hypocritical, but it's important for education, important for this field, because up to that point, education and conflict, or education emergency field, operated on the borders of countries in refugee camps. But once the international community started to go into countries, then that field started to expand inside. And so then we discover internally displaced people. We have to ask about the education of internally displaced people. We start to be operating inside conflicts rather than on the borders. And that has a range of implications, not least the fact that many more teachers, aid workers, ended up being killed during that period because it was a much more risky affair. As we move on, 9/11 becomes also a very important point, a very important transformation where education, and I can talk about this later, is really at the heart of many of the arguments. And as we go on, education becomes implicated through counterinsurgency strategies, the soft side of military intervention, building schools, training teachers. We've also had a whole surge of, what do we call it, de-radicalizing education, so education for de-radicalization. And more recently, big interest in refugees. And part of the growth of the interest in refugees and education is the willingness or the wish on the part of the West to encourage refugees to stay around the perimeters of the conflicts that they're fleeing and be educated there rather than come into Europe. So, you know, that interest in funding and education by international Western actors is part of a broader story of trying to keep refugees out of Fortress Europe or Fortress United States. So, you know, in a sense, you could chart the last 25 years and the major geopolitical events and see the way our field of education and emergencies has been shaped by those processes, not necessarily by need. There may be many displaced people in conflicts in certain places that are irrelevant to the core interests of the international community. The vast majority of increase in international development assistance between 2000 and 2010 was focused on those countries that were deemed part of the war on terror. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia. So you can see where the funding matched the focus of geopolitical interests. Now, part of my broader critique of the field of education in emergencies is that it really emerged as a service provider, answering questions for the donors, which is fine. And, you know, of course, this is a very complicated field. It needed support. It's a new emergent field, and people need to know how to operate, what to do in different contexts. Fortunately, we now have a new generation of academics and writers and authors that are also trying to theorize some of this. Maha Schwab in Lebanon, May Abu Mogli in Palestine, Tejendra Farali in Nepal, my colleague Sean Higgins working on Sierra Leone, and a range of other colleagues have started to try to take a much more critical reflection on these kind of issues. And again, what this thing starts to force you to do is that, I don't know whether it's the same for you, but we work on international development, and when students come into our courses, they say that they are studying international development with such pride. Now, if they were studying colonialism, they wouldn't say that with such pride, because colonialism is automatically constructed as bad and development is automatically constructed as good. And Umar Qatari and others have said we need to muddy the waters of this. Actually, there are much more connections between development and colonialism than one seeks to recognize. And it's important that we start to explore that. And if we look at our own field, this is a quote from about the Institute of Education, which, you know, is the primary education institute in the UK, you know, which from its foundations was clearly tied up in colonialism, constructed through the interests of the colonial office to support British imperial missions. Now, that same institute continues today with the language of education and international development, but underpinning that are many of these links. to its colonial past, which of course it's not only reflecting on now, but it also benefits from, no? Which is part of this argument of Michael Rothberg. Now, I don't want to kind of say that development studies is necessarily kind of amnesiac around this, and it doesn't recognize it. Mamdani points out that there were periods of time when development studies, the field of international development studies, was extremely critical and extremely radical in its focus. But as he says, development studies was once the critique of empire, but has now become the language of empire. And it's in a sense, I think that reflects the fact that many of us are much more dependent on international funders and donors. We have to raise external funding as academics. We're much more caught up in this business of delivering international development assistance. And often that leads us to try to please the payer, the paymaster, rather than push back and challenge them. So I think there are interesting things to reflect on. Now, Afghanistan in the paper comes up as a kind of, in a sense, a case of the present, of the way that we got caught up in this. And, you know, it was a good time to write it because last year was the withdrawal of US troops, as you all know. And there was a lot of stuff in the press saying, you know, the West went into Afghanistan to help girls, and after 2 decades it's leaving, what will happen to the girls? And there was a lot of soul searching. And, you know, of course there is a route to that. There was funding, but I think Jeffrey Sachs wrote a very important report which tried to track how much money was spent on different social sectors during this occupation. And he says that according to a recent report by the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan, the US invested roughly 946 billion between 2001 and 2021. Yet almost 1 trillion in outlays won the US few hearts and minds. And here is why. Of that 946 billion, fully 816 billion, or 86%, went to the military outlays for United States troops. And the Afghan people saw little of the remaining 130 billion, with 83 billion going to the Afghan security forces. Another 10 billion or so was spent on drug interdiction operations, while 15 billion was for US agencies operating in Afghanistan. That left a meager 21 billion in economic support funding. Yet even much of this spending left little in any, if any, development on the ground, because the programs actually support countering terrorism, bolster national economies, and assist in the development of effective, accessible, and independent legal systems. Now, if you did a scan of newspapers in this country and probably in the United States, and you put Afghanistan in, education would probably come up everywhere, yeah, because education discursively was mentioned all the time. Spending on education during that period was 0.17%, less than even 0.25% was spent on education. And for me, I think that reflects the difference between what happened and the way that we are narrated of what happened during this period. And in a sense, we could have, you know, foreseen this utilization of education, because education has been used before in the same context. And I'm sure that many of you are well aware of the way that education was used as a recruiting ground during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, with Pakistan being used in the borders as a recruiting ground to send, recruit, transport militants. And this is an image and a text of a maths book that was produced by the United States Agency for International Development, government body, in the 1980s, which spent over 50 million over a decade in producing textbooks, which essentially encouraged young Afghani refugees to go and fight, in the war in Afghanistan. An example from this, the speed of a Kalashnikov bullet is 800 meters per second. If a Russian is at a distance of 3,200 meters from a mujahid, and that mujahid aims at the Russian's head, calculate how many seconds it will take for the bullet to strike the Russian in the forehead. Quite extreme recruiting materials that if they were produced by anyone except for the United States, it would be across all of the newspapers, but very little is written and known about these things. And I guess part of what I'm saying is the way that education actors, who are often apolitical, get caught up in other people's missions. And this quote from Colin Powell in the wake of 9/11, he was addressing a meeting of all the United States NGOs, representatives of all the United States NGOs. And he says, as I speak, just as surely as our diplomats and military, American NGOs are out there serving and sacrificing on the front lines of freedom. I am serious about making sure we have the best relationship with our non-governmental organizations who are such a force multiplier for us, such an important part of our combat team. And in a sense, you can see there the way that NGOs are conceptualized as part of that combat team. Unfortunately, many of those people that are part of the combat team do not have tanks, do not have bodyguards, bulletproof cars, etc. And so also paid the price for being that, including one of my close friends, Jackie Kirk, who was murdered outside Kabul by the Taliban many years ago. And was considered by the Taliban, but also by the US, as part of the combat team. Yeah, so we are getting conceptualized, whether we like it or not, as part of that. So I think at the center of my argument is that madrasas, and after 9/11, became central to the discourse around the incompatibility between secular education and Islamic education. Arguments that many of the 9/11 bombers were schooled in religious madrasas, untrue, but nevertheless, let's not make an untruth a problem when you're making propaganda. Gender in education, drawed on discursively to say we're in Afghanistan for the girls, to bring education to girls, when we all know that we were in Afghanistan not because of girls, but because we were trying to punish the Afghan people for harboring Osama bin Laden and his militants. Lots of these ways of using binaries between Islam and Christianity and exaggerating those binaries to serve certain parties were done through education. And also the deployment of education as part of counterinsurgency strategies. So building schools, controlling schools, using schools and children as recruitment, informants, these kind of things. So a range of different ways. So I guess, like, to finish and to open up for questions, is to say that many of us that have worked over the last 20 years have used the discourse to say it's about the children. We're interested in supporting children in difficult conflict-affected contexts, and we're not part of those bigger games. My argument is either you recognize that you're part of those bigger games and fight back and organize yourself, or you will just become a tool of those bigger activities, as many of the practitioners and agencies became, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in many other parts of the world. So there is, in a sense, a need to push back. And, you know, part of the importance of training a new generation of young researchers and scholars to say, you need to have a schooling in geopolitics. You can't just understand education within itself. You need to understand education's relationships to broader social, economic, political processes. Because if you don't, those things will come and hit you anyway. So it's important to have that. And in that process, we then start to need to think about resetting some lenses around education and emergencies, reflecting on some of those histories, and starting to push back and to try to challenge that. And I think there are pockets of evidence to say that these things are in process, but we shouldn't underestimate the challenges that we face. And now it's not the war on terror. Now that and I'm sure that there is a certain amount of relief that the war on terror is not the central focus, but the central focus now is a Russophobia and a binary between China and Russia and the United States and the West over Ukraine, but in many parts, which again is engulfing our education community. And we are in danger of reproducing exactly the same naive sleepwalking into supporting these processes in this emerging new Cold War that I think are in now and is likely to get worse. So I guess I'm saying really that we as researchers, students, practitioners have agency. We need to use that agency to challenge some of these processes and to reflect and recognize some of our responsibility, both for the past, but also for the present. Okay, that's me done. I hope I haven't talked too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Novelli, for this excellent presentation. Enjoyed the paper thoroughly, and I'm sure everyone else has. And I will open the floor for questions. But before other people, before other questions come, I have a question, and I really like your use of implicated subject. And what you say about education in emergencies is also, certain aspects of it are also relevant to what goes on usually within national context when you don't really, when the conflict is, what do you say, not, is somehow at subliminal level, when you can just sense it, it's not there. Mm-hmm. So how do you sort of, if you're thinking about decolonization, how do you think we can trigger this process when the very criteria of success that we define is based on this symbolic domination, and in which we expect some sort of dislocation of self, where we need to sort of align with the West and to leave everything which is traditional and something that, indigenous knowledge is bad. How do we go about it? Because we as educators become implicated subjects. Over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that, the condition, I think that, you reflect that argument around the conditions of production, which of course are extremely powerful, no? And I think then we have to break down or even look at specific examples and think about historical or contemporary examples of the way academic subjects, academic practitioners have pushed back against these things. So I give you an example from anthropology. Anthropology became mobilized during the Iraq occupation when the US recognized, the US military recognized that it couldn't just bomb from above. It had to fight on the ground. And in order to fight on the ground, it needed to understand the hearts and minds of the populations that it was dealing with. So it started to recruit an anthropologist in every unit. So suddenly you had these scholars, anthropologists, as part of military. And if you look at the history of the American Anthropological Association, you'll see that it started to organize against this, to challenge this, to reveal what was going on. No? So I think there's a lesson there about collectivity, about organizing, about using your power to support junior colleagues that are more vulnerable than yourself. So, when we have young critical scholars in the early stages of their career, they need our support to say, no, it's okay, you keep going. You keep speaking out. Don't be silenced. Yeah. So we have some individual responsibilities there. More generally, we network across academic fields and try to open up. And this is a slow process. Yeah. I felt like I was a very lone voice a decade ago when I was writing similar things. Today, I feel less lonely because I know that I have a good group of international colleagues that are working in this areas. No, so that's in a sense the kind of individual and collective activities. But then there is another one that is really complicated to address, which is the institutional power and pressure and the limited resources that we have access to, which push us to go in certain directions. And that's really very difficult now. People have tenure, they have to prove themselves, they have to write in the right journals, they have to get funding, and all these things push against them. So I don't think there are any easy solutions to this. But you know, I certainly in my last in the last stages of my academic career, I've gone to get funding from much more blue skies research councils, and I don't really work at all with donors or UNICEF anymore or United Nations, because I know that they will push me into certain things that I don't want to go. But I recognize that, you know, we're caught up in those processes. And I think it's important to recognize those, even if sometimes we feel we're also implicated in them. You know, that that's not an easy thing to do, but we should try to raise those issues.
Right. There are some questions over here.
Yeah.
And the first question is coming from Arshad Khan, who is saying, why should education actually focus on conflicts and crises, and why not on economy? This is very much a new liberal thinking. Over to you.
Yeah, no, well, that's a very good question. And of course, the history of the field of education has been dominated by the economics of education. No? In a sense, maybe you should reverse the question and say, well, you know, why is it not sufficient to focus on the economy? And, you know, I think you only have to look at those countries that have gone through violent conflict to know what damage violent conflict can do to an economy and to society. Yeah. So, you know, I was thinking about that last week when we're, you know, the international community is all present in New York, and we're all working towards the social development goals. So not just economic goals, but political, social goals, broad goals, yeah? All of those objectives, all of that funding is irrelevant if we have a nuclear war in the next 2 years. We need to recognize that conflict matters. So just on that basis, I think it's important. But also, I think we need to recognize that education is so much more than economy. Education is about society. It's about how people live with each other, deal with each other. If we just focus on the economy, we will miss out on all of those cognitive processes that happen between teacher and student, between school and society. So I think that the lenses have to go broader, but that's not to say that education, economy doesn't matter. I've never said that. I've always said, of course, you need economics. And in fact, at the root of many of these conflicts is economic inequality. Yeah? Some people have the money, some people don't have it. So working on more equal economies is important. But then we have to understand what type of economy we're looking for in the future. What kind of models are we preparing for? So I hope that's a good enough answer for you.
Thank you very much. There is another, we have Varis Wazir. Varis, can you hear me? So Varis is doing his thesis on impacts of war on terror on women education in South Waziristan in Pakistan from 2004 to 2020. And he said, I have a few questions. Varis, are you here? All right. So in any case, please put your question. You have not put your question over here. And then there is another question by Roma Ali. And she says, what do you do when there is so much foreign when there is so much dependency on foreign funding to educate people? For instance, they're in this form of either scholarships are given or the donors are giving some money for female education. So how do you sort of like, while benefiting the system, and then how do you raise questions? How does one go about it?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer to that, but you know, in a sense, that's a responsibility of all of us. In a sense, you know, my role, I see my role as putting pressure on these donors to make transparent the reasons why they invest in certain things and not in others, to force them to justify that. As a recipient on the ground,
Yeah.
of course, you have different questions, no?
Yeah.
We always get these chevening scholars coming
Yeah.
to the UK. And I always ask in the beginning, how many of you got a chevening scholarship? And, you know, people put their hand up quite proudly because it's a very difficult scholarship to get to. And I say, why do you think they are giving you the money to study? You know?
Yeah.
So it's about raising awareness and raising consciousness. But of course, there is also a question of power that countries, I would have said, like Pakistan, like India, like South Africa, are in a relatively good position to dictate terms compared to very small, very low-income countries. Yeah, where, for example, Sierra Leone, 50% of the entire education budget is coming from external forces. So very little autonomy in terms of, you know, the donor coordinating group is so powerful in those contexts. Yeah, so that's why I think, you know, part of this is saying that the aid industry is fundamentally wrong, because it gives the power of Western nations power to determine issues. And that's why so many people these days are calling for not an international development fund, but a reparations fund for the legacies of all the damage that colonialism, environmental damage caused by northern countries over the years should go into a pot which is managed by those countries themselves. No, so very different way. But of course, that's way beyond my pay grade to be able to do that stuff. No?
There is another question. Thank you so much. There is another question by Mas, and he's saying that in conflict areas, the educators are forced to narrow down the scope of education because there are several factors at play, like there's the lack of resources and danger to life. And in these cases, what should be the scope of education in these areas? What should be the primary aim of education in these conflict-ridden areas? Over to you.
I mean, I think that in all of that, both geographically and temporally, depending on whether it's in the beginning of a conflict, during a conflict, at the end of a conflict, we need to have an analysis of what is going on in those societies. So no template, but an analysis of the context, the history, the challenges, and where education fits in, and then a balance between what we would like to do and the limits of the possible. No, so of course we don't have all the resources that we want. We're not often able to do all those things. So in a sense, the question say, okay, in the middle of a conflict, what are you able to do? Well, often not very much. You can bring kids together, and maybe you can provide a safe space for them to feel calm, to feel loved, to be able to deal with some of the traumas. You probably can't deliver a full curriculum to these children. Maybe that has to come later. But these always have financial implications in terms of what we can afford to do in different contexts. You know, there is a lot of push around the need for effective learning, no socio-cultural interventions, dealing with trauma. The International Rescue Committee, which is one of the big agencies that works in a lot of places around the world in education, they set up this whole scheme called Healing Classrooms, which in a sense was this idea that you had to create a very nurturing environment inside the classroom, because these kids would be going through many trauma. You know, getting down to economics, this may be the place where you can deliver healthcare, food, the basics that maybe children are missing. No, so education is often a really good delivery device to provide children with the things that they need. No, but again, this all depends. I'm very much into local solutions rather than global kind of templates, because I think these global templates, they rarely function.
Right. So there is another question by a comment rather from Rida, and she's asking you, what is your opinion about it? And she says in one of the papers she read, she said that when international aid comes in from the West in a developing nation, so they, instead of perpetuate, so what they do is they actually perpetuate the very differences that they are trying to address. So, and linking it to the idea of an illusion of a broken system, whereby the stakeholders in the broken system have not even seen it as broken. So she's saying, how do you redefine your idea of facilitating the conflict or injustices that exist within that society that you believe requires development? And somehow, I mean, this is an interesting, I mean, thing. Think of also, and what is your take on this education of girls in Afghanistan? So well, I'm just saying, was some sort of intervention needed? If it was needed, how did it sort of like, there was a, what do you say, pushback? I mean, just a little sort of like, what do you do in these circumstances?
Well, I mean, I have a current PhD student from Afghanistan. His father was a teacher in a girls' school. He was murdered by Taliban, and his son now is with us. He's in exile, and he's doing a PhD on girls' education in Afghanistan. And he's developing a critique of intervention. And, you know, he's drawing on some of my work, but also, you know, a much richer experience of being an educator during that period, because he was, apart from his dad being an educator, he was also a teacher himself. And he was saying that, you know, the West is so naive to the realities of what is going on in our societies. It has no in-depth knowledge of all the dynamics, and it comes in with these solutions that are so so lacking in nuance that they aggravate precisely what the question is talking about. So in a sense, he's a very strong advocate for education for girls. But he argues that the West cannot resolve that issue. It has to be an internal solution that we have to address and work together. So again, I think this is about power, and it's about pushback and the capacity of local communities, regions to develop their own solutions, drawing quite rightfully on the resources from outside, but not necessarily the expertise. That might be one ways of moving forward. But yeah, there is so much evidence to say that development, and people distinguish often between development and big D development. And development is the development of the history of capitalism all around the world. And big D development is, I think, what we're talking about here, which is about international development actors, the United Nations, all of these kind of things. And I think many people are coming to the recognition that big D development is largely irrelevant. I mean, if we look at the elimination of or the reduction of poverty in the world over the last 3 decades, it's largely due to transformations in China and India.
Right.
I don't think in either China or India, the Western international development actors can claim success for that. That has happened because of economic growth of these 2 huge countries. So what is then the purpose of international development? And that's something that I ask myself every day and say, should I be teaching international development or should I do something else? Because maybe international development is not helpful to supporting development.
So one last question. Thank you so much. So Virus is here who was working on a thesis I talked about earlier. And he says, why do we need to actually focus on education when there has been a conflict? Because the major damage that has been done is in terms of economy, and these are the economic issues that they're facing. So why should education be even the first priority?
Okay, well, if you interview, and there's lots of polls that have done this, of interview people who have been affected by conflict and ask them what is important to them, education is often very high up on their list. Education matters. And I think education matters for a reason, because often people have lost a lot. And one thing you can't take away is your education if it's inside here. No?
Absolutely.
So that in a sense is one of the arguments for education. Secondly, if you want to recover from an economy, you need human capital. So if human capital has been missing out for a generation, and that's the thing, is conflicts don't last for 1 year or 2 years. They last a long time, 10, 12, 15 years. So we're talking about whole generations that have gone without education. So I think there are a range of reasons why education matters, but I'm not one of those people that says, look, all the money should go on education. No, we need to be housed, we need food, we need to be clothed. There are certain basics, but I do think that education is up there. And I do think that I wish the world spent more money on education than it does on weapons, on all of these things for mass destruction that we're currently engaged in.
Thank you so much, Professor Mario Novelli. It has been a privilege and rare honor for us to have this talk with you, to listen in to your ideas. We are going to request everyone in the audience to turn on their cameras so we can take a picture.
Sure.
All right. Arslan, are you taking the picture, please?
Can I request Dr. Mario to stop sharing the screen so that
Yes.
everyone should be there?
You can. It might take me a while to understand how to do that. Yeah, we go. There we go.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. We're going to discuss these ideas in our class also. So thank you so much for giving us so much food for thought.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right. Be ready for the picture, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So
Goodbye.
much. Thank you. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Love is.